So, my name is Madeline Cook, and for my topic on the research paper, I chose to talk about the Peter Pan music example because I was very interested in the film that we were required to watch for a previous assignment called Real Engine. And that talked just kind of about the way that American culture is misappropriated and misrepresented through Hollywood films. And I found that to be very interesting. And so I chose to focus specifically on the music in these films and how the music representations throughout the films were misappropriations of the American Indian culture. And so I'm going to start by talking about some of the key terms that were discussed throughout my paper. And in talking about each of them, I'm going to relate them to my topic in the Peter Pan music examples and how each term kind of relates to these specific examples that I chose for my project. And so to begin, singing red face is one of the terms, and it is just the idea of becoming native in a musical performance. And specifically an example of singing red face in the film Peter Pan, the use of the clothing the characters are seen wearing, just in the scene where they're sitting in a circle playing the drum, and some of the female characters are seen dancing. And the example of the clothing there in face paint and headdresses of what many people think to be traditional of American Indian culture. And so to start, that is just one way that they're kind of making the characters become native by having them wear these things so that more people will recognize that that's what they are intending to portray these characters as. And the way the women are dancing along with the music is also an example of singing red face, kind of, because it adds the component of dance as an attempt, which can be seen as an attempt to make it a little bit more native, because it is typical of Native American music to use dance as a very important component of their music. And so by using this addition, they're also kind of having the characters become native in even just adding the aspect of dance just to make them seem more native and for them to portray them so that we will better see them that way. The next term is racial antipathy, and it is the idea that the way American Indian culture is presented through popular American culture, such as music, gives non-natives false ideas of the American Indian culture. And one example of this is the style of dance that was portrayed in this scene, which was the way that the girl was flirtatiously dancing around the drum and the male characters were kind of lustfully admiring her, which isn't necessarily characteristic of American Indian like music and the dance component of the music. However, because they used this as a component in the way that they portrayed this dance, it gave audience members a false sense of and a false representation of the dance and the type of dance that they typically use in Native American music. And another example of this would be the way that the drums were played, specifically how they were played without mallets and with all the members in a circle. And that is just an example because it shows that that is kind of what the audience's first idea of Native American Indian culture would be, based on how they presented the dance and the music in like the way in this setting that it was played in, how they were in a circle and all of that stuff. And that kind of could set the grounding for how people would view that in the future and how they view like the settings that they play these kind of music in and everything. And that's an example of racial antipathy in that it gives people, non-native people that aren't aware or familiar with the culture, it gives them the sense that that is traditional of the culture, when in fact it might be a misrepresentation. Another key term was idealized sympathy, and idealized sympathy is projected sympathy towards an imaginary native caricature, and it is often in songs that feature this sympathy that the misrepresentations of the culture become increasingly visible. And it was talked a lot about in chapter 6, and it said that a lot of it comes from renditions of songs and people trying to change some of the messages within the songs to make them maybe more appropriate or sensitive to the culture. And in doing so, they completely change the message they're trying to get across unintentionally, but this makes the sympathy isn't necessarily good in helping or forwarding the understanding of real American Indian culture, because it just kind of, to me, it reminded me of a game of telephone, how when changing different things, the messages can get misconstrued, and then we get false representations and ideas from that as well. Another term was cultural confusion, and the many years of popular false representations of American Indian culture leads to cultural confusion, in that many individuals may not know what an accurate representation of the culture is. So an example of this in Peter Pan would be, Peter Pan is definitely targeted primarily to a younger audience. And so in doing this from a very young age, individuals in popular Western American culture are shown false representation of what American Indian culture is. And specifically, the way they portray American Indian culture in Peter Pan is one of the first representations of this culture that individuals of a very young age are going to see, and people that are unrelated to this culture and unfamiliar with this culture will kind of form a basis of what they understand to be characteristic of this culture based on these representations they're seeing in films in their early childhood, such as Peter Pan. And blackface, minstrelsy kind of goes along with cultural misappropriation, and we'll talk about that in just a second. But this can be dated as far back to the use of blackface in minstrel shows. And these shows are pretty under talked about throughout history, and I didn't know about them prior to reading this chapter and doing further research on them, but these shows were specifically a way for white Americans to explore their curiosity in regards to African Americans at the time that slavery was really prominent. And these shows often featured white men in blackface performing Negro song and dances. And this is a way of cultural misappropriation because they're kind of generalizing the culture to a certain subset of people, when in reality there's a bunch of different races, ethnicities, and components that go into a culture, and so they're kind of diminishing that in looping it all together, which is characteristic of cultural misappropriation. And another term was playing Indian, which is just kind of reinforced by the idea of becoming Indian. And it's seen really in the Peter Pan scene in the false translation of the Indian language the Indian language. It was actually a mock language that they used. Rather than using proper languages, they just chose, or even not translating at all, they chose to use a mock language in which they use false translations. And so that is really characteristic of playing Indian, in that really anything that they're doing to show that these people are American Indians isn't anything that has a basis, because none of it is actually true or accurate to their culture, and instead they just kind of made up a language in what they called American Indian for this movie. And then lastly, which was kind of the main focus of the paper, was cultural misappropriation. And it's the idea of using cultural aspects from another culture inaccurately or inappropriately. And I did some previous research just on cultural misappropriation, specifically in American Indian cultures. And I found an article by Boya in 1999. And it was in this article that the author talked about how music is viewed differently between American Indian cultures and Western American culture, which I found to be very interesting. And in specifically, the way they view music plays into the cultural misappropriation, because these two cultures specifically view music in such a different way. So in Western American culture, music is seen as existing on its own. It's in its own sphere. It's separate from a lot of important cultural beliefs, and it is primarily used for enjoyment. American Indian cultures, however, view music as being inseparable from many important aspects of their lives, such as social presentations, traditions, just their main beliefs. And mainly music is often seen as a way to honor traditions and as a way to connect and have communication with supernatural. And so enjoyment often doesn't factor into the use of music at all in these cultures. And one way in which the misappropriation of American Indian culture is carried out in music is when somebody who is unknowledgeable about certain kind of musics, the genre, the meanings, the traditions behind the music. When they attempt to duplicate the music or really perform it in any way, they're misappropriating the culture because they're not familiar with what the meaning of what they're doing is. And so another article I found written by Reverend Jason Shelton reflected on a time in which he was part of a worship situation in which a song leader at the worship gathering poorly performed what he called poorly performed an African American spiritual song. And he said that in this situation, the song leader was just very unskilled and unaware of the particular music style, which made the situation appear as very disrespectful. And he stated that it wasn't only disrespectful to people of the African American community that were there, or anybody that relates with that culture or the race or ethnicity, but it was more disrespectful to everyone involved, and really just everyone, for trying to imitate this culture that they weren't familiar with. And in doing so, they didn't do it accurately, which causes a misappropriation of cultures or just a misrepresentation in general. So my overall conclusion from using the Peter Pan example and the music that was in Peter Pan was just that from a very young age, Western Americans are shown representations that are inaccurate through music and film, and specifically as represented in the movie Peter Pan. And even prior to a lot of these films, there were a lot of other films that kind of were misrepresentations of the American Indian culture, and in the way that they use their music and the aspects of clothing and dance as well. Due to the cultural misappropriation of American Indian culture through popular American culture music, and specifically in the case that I chose to focus on, music and films, in my example specifically being music featured in Peter Pan. I think it's just really important that artists, and really all individuals for that matter, become increasingly educated on the American Indian culture, both past and present. And it would be very beneficial and potentially even create a change in this misappropriation if Western Americans were corrected in their false beliefs that they have obtained and gathered through the misrepresentation and misappropriation of the music that they have seen throughout films and the way that they use the music to portray the American Indian culture. And so just to be corrected in these beliefs as a way to reduce cultural confusion would just be to really educate everybody on the real parts and real aspects of the culture. And I think in doing this, we could really eventually reduce singing red face and therefore reduce other issues, including racial antipathy, idealized sympathy, cultural confusion, and mainly and importantly, as discussed in this paper, cultural misappropriation.